The result glowing on the laboratory monitor simply should not be there. Clara stared at the sequence of genetic markers flashing before her eyes and felt that something fundamental about canine history had just collapsed. As an experienced geneticist, she had spent years mapping the DNA of the oldest working dog lineages in the world. That afternoon, she was analyzing samples from the famous Australian Shepherd. For decades, the world accepted a clean and closed narrative about these animals. The official legend stated that they were shaped in the dusty American West during the 19th century to help ranchers control sheep imported from Australia. The very name of the breed seemed to seal this recent geographical destiny. Clara always thought that explanation was a bit too convenient. And now, the blood of those dogs was telling a version that was impossible to ignore. The marks engraved in the Australian Shepherd's genetic code pointed to paths no one expected to find, revealing a legacy of survival much older than the borders of the United States or the Australian plains. If you want to understand what is really behind this story and discover the mysteries that genetics has only now managed to untangle, you have found the perfect documentary. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel right now, because the journey we are going to take today will forever change the way you look at the origins of breeds. That anomaly in the data was not a glitch. It was the whisper of ancient generations. Clara held the proof that the breed did not begin on American farms, but in a distant past, crossing oceans long before the modern era. But that was just the beginning. The strangest detail was yet to come, and what she found in the subsequent genetic crosses would completely change the landscape. Clara began to pull at the loose thread of this genetic tangle, crossing the raw data from her samples with ancient records of human migration. What she saw emerging on her screens was the outline of an impossible map. The DNA markers indicated a robust European heritage, but not one born of aristocratic lineages, carefully bred in luxurious estates. Instead, these were the genetic signatures of rustic, resilient animals that lived under brutal conditions along the mountainous borders of the Pyrenees, nestled between Spain and France. There, centuries before anyone even entertained the idea of establishing aesthetic breed standards, isolated communities depended entirely on herding to survive the unforgiving winters. Strong women, Basque shepherdesses who often carried the weight of their family's survival while the men were away at sea or in distant fields, bred these dogs based on one absolute, non-negotiable criterion: the autonomous ability to solve complex problems in deep snow and treacherous rocky terrain. The Australian Shepherd as we recognize it today did not exist in those mountains, but the deep foundations of its almost frightening intelligence and unwavering loyalty were being forged daily on those freezing slopes. Science allows us to understand so much more about the origins of these incredible behaviors, and if you want to dive deeper into the specific techniques and methods of animal handling that stem from this fascinating genetic history, you will find all that knowledge gathered in our complete material, linked right down in the description and in the pinned comment. Continue watching, because what happens next complicates this mystery even further. During the 19th century, severe famine and sweeping economic shifts forced many of these Basque families to leave their homeland behind and venture into the absolute unknown. They packed their meager belongings, gathered their flocks, and, inevitably, brought their indispensable working dogs with them. Historical shipping records showed Clara that many of these immigrant vessels first docked in Australia before eventually crossing the Pacific Ocean toward the promised land of the American West. And that was precisely where the great historical confusion took root. When those immigrant shepherds finally arrived in California with their flocks coming from the other side of the world, the local American ranchers simply began calling their agile, hyper-intelligent dogs Australian Shepherds, completely ignoring the centuries of rich European history pulsing through their veins. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the mystery of the breed's origin had been neatly solved. Clara had successfully traced the geographical path through the old shipping routes, providing a logical explanation for how the name ended up attached to these dogs. The story made perfect sense and seemed to close the chapter on the breed's history, but in science, neat endings are rarely the whole truth. When Clara isolated a very specific section of the genome responsible for their unique color patterns and their hyper-responsiveness to human visual commands, she realized that the biological math simply did not add up. The genetic contribution of the Basque dogs perfectly explained their resilience and structural build, but there were dominant fragments hiding in the DNA of the Australian Shepherd that had never existed in the Iberian Peninsula. There was another invisible passenger on this ancient journey, a ghost in the genetic code that demanded an explanation. Clara knew that to find this ghost, she had to look beyond the established timelines of the American frontier. The history books had always painted a very convenient and romanticized picture of the 19th century American West. It was an era defined by relentless expansion, the California gold rush, and a booming, desperate demand for wool that brought massive flocks of sheep to the sprawling western valleys. According to the official records, the ranchers who built empires in this unforgiving, sun-baked landscape needed a dog that could handle the brutal heat, the treacherous terrain, and the sheer, overwhelming volume of livestock. When the Basque shepherds arrived via Australia with their sturdy, intelligent working dogs, the American ranchers believed they had found the final piece of their agricultural puzzle. They took these rugged dogs, bred them on their vast ranches, and proudly claimed to have forged a brand new American breed, naming them Australian Shepherds, simply because of the ships they had arrived on. For over a century, this was the undisputed truth. The dogs became an enduring symbol of Western cowboy culture, celebrated in rodeo arenas, rode alongside horses, and became entrenched in ranching lore as a homegrown masterpiece. It was a perfect, neatly wrapped story of American ingenuity and adaptation. But as Clara meticulously aligned the complex genetic sequences on her laboratory screens in the dead of night, the biological reality stubbornly refused to match the historical pride. If the American West was truly the birthplace of these dogs, the DNA should show a clear genetic bottleneck, a distinct biological starting point, where a few imported Basque dogs were bred together in isolation to create a uniform population. Furthermore, the mutation rate required to develop their highly specialized traits entirely within the short time span of the American frontier was scientifically impossible. Evolution simply does not work that fast, especially not when it comes to complex behavioral wiring, extreme athletic stamina, and intricate coat color patterns. Clara was looking at a genetic diversity that was far too rich, far too explosive to have been born suddenly in the dusty plains of California just a few decades ago. The DNA revealed that when these dogs arrived in America, they were not raw material waiting to be molded by ambitious ranchers. They were already fully formed masterpieces of ancient genetic engineering, carrying sophisticated traits that had been locked into their blood over millennia of harsh survival. The false resolution of the Western origin story began to crumble completely under the weight of the undeniable data. Clara realized that the American ranchers had not created the Australian Shepherd at all. They had merely inherited a biological legacy that was already ancient before the first cowboy ever saddled a horse. The genetic injection she was seeing in the code was sudden and massive, indicating that the Basque dogs had not arrived alone. They had been crossed, either during their long oceanic voyages or immediately upon their arrival in the colonies, with another deeply entrenched, highly specialized line of herding dogs. Clara cross-referenced the anomalous alleles with global canine databases, her eyes scanning the results as the system processed billions of data points. She was looking for the true source of the extreme intelligence, the mesmerizing variations in eye color, and that famous obsessive herding instinct that defined the breed today. The computer finally returned a definitive match, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the arid landscapes of Australia or the rugged canyons of the American West. The genetic markers lit up a completely different part of the world map, pointing directly toward the damp, fog-covered highlands of the British Isles. Long before the modern concept of dog breeds even existed, British shepherds were relying on highly specialized working dogs that possessed the exact same genetic anomalies Clara was staring at right now. The ghost in the genetic code had finally revealed its face, and it was about to rewrite everything the world thought it knew about the most famous herding dog in America. Clara leaned back in her chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in her eyes as the pieces of this ancient biological puzzle finally began to snap together. To understand what the DNA was telling her, she had to completely abandon the modern concept of dog breeds. Before the Victorian era, when wealthy aristocrats began breeding dogs for dog shows and aesthetic perfection, a working dog in the British Isles was defined solely by its job. There were no stud books, no pedigree registries, and certainly no strict physical standards. If a dog could move a flock of stubborn sheep across a steep, rain-slicked valley in the Scottish Highlands, it was kept, fed, and bred. If it could not, it was useless. Clara sifted through archival texts, comparing 19th-century agricultural journals with her cutting-edge genomic maps. She was searching for the exact origin point of the most iconic physical trait of the Australian shepherd, the striking mottled blue merle coat and those piercing ice blue or mismatched eyes. The genetic markers did not lie. That specific mutation, known as the PMEL gene, had been thriving in the rugged, fog-drenched landscapes of Scotland, Wales and England for centuries. The British shepherds needed highly visible dogs that stood out against the dark, heather-covered hills, and could respond to complex whistle commands from miles away in thick weather. They bred for extreme physical stamina, hyper-responsiveness to human direction, and a coat pattern that looked almost like a starry night. But how did these brilliant British herders merge with the fierce, independent dogs of the Basque women? The answer, Clara discovered, was written in the massive, sweeping currents of the British Empire. During the height of British colonial expansion, massive agricultural operations were established in the newly claimed territories of Australia. The British brought their finest sheep, and naturally their finest working dogs, to manage them on the vast, unforgiving outback. This was the missing link, the grand intersection of two entirely different worlds. When the Basque shepherds fled Europe and arrived in Australia seeking work, their incredibly resilient Pyrenean dogs were suddenly working side by side with the highly trainable, merle-coated British collies. Out there, in the isolated, sun-scorched Australian stations, nature and human necessity acted as the ultimate genetic editors. The dogs bred with each other. The resulting offspring inherited the absolute best of both ancient worlds. They gained the unbreakable, autonomous grit of the Basque guardians and the lightning-fast, eager-to-please agility of the British herders. This revelation changes absolutely everything we know about how these animals think and react. If this deep dive into their hidden history is blowing your mind, you need to see what else we have uncovered. By understanding these exact ancient genetic crossings, you can drastically improve how you interact with your own dog today. In the complete material linked in the description and in the first comment, you will discover how to activate the specific behavioral triggers your dog inherited from these British shepherds, how to correctly channel the intense, boundless energy of a working hybrid to prevent anxiety, and how to identify the hidden genetic markers that directly impact their long-term health and nutrition. It is a complete guide to speaking their ancient language, so be sure to check that link right now. As Clara continued to map this incredible fusion, she realized the sheer irony of the breed's history. The name Australian Shepherd was not a complete lie, but rather a profoundly misunderstood truth. They were indeed forged in Australia, not as a native species, but as a spectacular, accidental masterpiece born from the collision of European refugees and British colonizers. By the time these hybrid dogs were loaded onto ships bound for the booming agricultural markets of California and the American West, their genetic recipe was already locked in. The American ranchers who received them on the docks of San Francisco were utterly amazed by their stamina, their hypnotic eyes, and their uncanny ability to anticipate a cowboy's next move. The Americans did not invent the dog. They were simply the lucky recipients of a biological lottery that had taken centuries, multiple continents, and the harsh realities of global migration to perfect. The Australian Shepherd was a living, breathing map of human history, carrying the silent memories of Scottish rains, Pyrenean snows, and Australian droughts within every single cell. Yet as Clara's research pushed even deeper into the sequencing, a much darker reality began to emerge from the data. The very same genetic isolation and intense selective breeding that had locked in their absolute brilliance and stunning appearance had also trapped something deeply dangerous inside their DNA. The story of their creation was about to reveal a heavy, biological price that these animals are still paying to this very day. Clara stared at the glowing monitors as the genetic sequence folded into a map of unintended consequences. The very same biological mechanisms that gave the Australian Shepherd its mesmerizing beauty and unparalleled work ethic were inextricably linked to a series of hidden genetic time bombs. In the ruthless and expanding environment of the American West, ranchers bred their dogs based on pure, unfiltered utility. If a dog possessed the hyper-focused stamina to drive a massive flock across miles of scorching, arid valleys, and happened to have that striking, highly visible merle coat, it was immediately bred to pass those traits along. But this relentless, utilitarian selection was completely blind to the molecular damage accumulating just beneath the surface. Clara discovered that the PMEL mutation, the exact gene responsible for the silver and blue marbled fur that the world had come to adore, carried a devastating biological tax. When two dogs with this specific genetic marker were crossed in a desperate human attempt to guarantee the aesthetic and physical stamina of the next generation, the resulting puppies faced a catastrophic genetic anomaly. The double mutation stripped the pigment not just from their fur, but from the vital microscopic cells within their inner ears and eyes. Entire litters were born profoundly deaf and completely blind, discarded by the harsh realities of nature as the tragic collateral damage of human ambition. The very trait that made them so visually striking and valuable on the misty hills of Britain was now causing irreversible sensory failure. And the cost of their brilliance did not stop at their physical health. Clara's research delved deeper into the neurological wiring of the breed, uncovering the unsettling truth behind their legendary intelligence. The Australian Shepherd was genetically engineered to be obsessive. Their brains were hardwired to seek constant motion, to analyze, anticipate, and control the environment around them with a borderline neurotic intensity. On a sprawling 19th-century ranch, this obsessive drive was the ultimate asset. It kept the livestock alive, the predators at bay, and the ranchers in business. But as Clara looked at the modern behavioral data, she realized the tragedy of this ancient inheritance. When these dogs were removed from the vast open spaces of the frontier and placed into the quiet, confined environments of modern suburban homes, that ancient working drive had absolutely nowhere to go. The genetic command to herd, to run, and to protect did not simply switch off because the environment changed. Instead, it mutated into severe anxiety, destructive behaviors, and profound psychological distress. The dog's mind, brilliantly built to solve life-or-death problems on rocky cliffs and endless plains, was essentially short-circuiting in the modern world. They were suffering from the very genius that their human companions had aggressively demanded of them for centuries. The history of the Australian Shepherd was no longer just a triumphant tale of agricultural conquest. It was a deeply cautionary story about the heavy price of genetic manipulation and the immense responsibility humans bear when we alter the biological blueprint of another living creature. We demanded absolute loyalty and tireless labor, and these dogs gave us their minds, their bodies, and their very genome in return. If you are fascinated by these incredible scientific discoveries and want to help us uncover more hidden truths about the natural world, please take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the real price of this genetic history. Your support is what makes these deep investigations possible. Clara realized that every modern Australian Shepherd, whether resting quietly on a living room rug or competing fiercely in an agility ring, was carrying the heavy echoes of this brutal history. The high energy, the piercing stare, the tendency to nip at the heels of running children. These were not random behavioral quirks or training flaws. They were ancient, deeply ingrained survival mechanisms, programmed into their DNA by Basque shepherdesses facing freezing winters and British farmers battling the elements, and later amplified by the unforgiving demands of American cowboys. The breed was a living paradox, a creature of breathtaking capability burdened by the physical and mental scars of its own creation. As Clara prepared to synthesize her final findings, the emotional weight of the story settled over her laboratory. She knew that to truly honor these animals, the world needed to stop looking at them merely as beautiful pets or romanticized symbols of the Old West. We needed to fundamentally understand the profound sacrifice coded into their blood, and the final piece of the genome she was about to decode would completely redefine the legacy of the working dog. Clara sat back in the dim light of her laboratory, the glowing sequences of DNA now reading less like a biological schematic and more like a sacred ancient diary. The genome of the Australian Shepherd was no longer just a list of traits, mutations, and physical capabilities. It was a profound, living record of human endurance. Every marker, every beautiful anomaly, and every tragic flaw was a footprint left behind by the people who had depended on these dogs for their very survival. Clara saw the indomitable spirit of the Basque shepherdesses, women who had braved the freezing, isolated peaks of the Pyrenees with nothing but their resilient dogs by their side. She saw the calculating, tireless minds of the British farmers who demanded absolute perfection in the rain-soaked highlands. And she saw the relentless, desperate hope of the immigrant families who packed their lives into the hulls of ships, crossing brutal oceans to reach the sun-baked frontiers of Australia and the American West. The Australian shepherd did not belong to a single nation, nor was it the simple invention of a 19th-century cowboy culture. It was a masterpiece of global migration, a creature shaped by the tears, the sweat, and the unyielding determination of generations of working families. The boundaries we draw around modern dog breeds are incredibly recent, almost an illusion compared to the vast, interwoven history these animals actually carry in their blood. They are the silent, steadfast witnesses to our own long journey across the earth. When you look into the striking, mismatched eyes of an Australian shepherd today, you are not just looking at a beautiful companion. You are looking directly into the history of humanity itself, staring back at you with the exact same loyalty that kept our ancestors alive through the darkest, coldest nights of our past. If this deep dive into the hidden genetic history of the Australian shepherd has moved you and completely changed the way you look at the bond between humans and animals, please share this documentary with someone who loves dogs as much as you do, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering these breathtaking stories together. The true history of the world is hiding in the most unexpected places, sometimes right at our feet, waiting patiently for someone to finally